Hey there, grace and peace to you all. It's Captain Roger from the Salvation Army Corps in Hanford, California. Welcome to the Shield Online, our weekly worship and study time. Hey, we are examining some of the lies that we tell in Sunday school. Well-meaning and well-intentioned changes to the scriptural stories, but wrong nonetheless. Now, today's story is often told to kids like the story of a Disney princess. So let's just go through it before I say too much. This is the story of Esther, the brave girl who became a queen. Esther was a Jewish girl. Her mom and dad died, but her cousin took care of her. King Xerxes held a contest to find a wife, and Esther won. She got to marry Xerxes. Haman was the king's helper. He did not like Jews, especially not Esther's cousin Mordecai. Haman decided to get rid of the Jews and take their things. The king didn't know that Esther was Jewish. Esther wasn't sure what to do. She was afraid to say anything, but didn't want her people to be hurt. Oh, what to do? Esther prayed. Her cousin and his friends did too. Then Esther felt brave and went to talk to the king. She asked him to save her people, and he did. Everyone was happy except Haman. Hooray for Esther. The end. Yeah, so there's your kid version of this story. Totally Disney. You got a helpless girl, you got dead parents, a dopey king played for comic relief, the underhanded villain, a crazy, impossible situation to resolve, a solution that was way too easy, and a happy ending for everyone but the villain, whose defeat is cheered. Now, as you might suspect, the real story is very different. And Esther is a long book, so I'm going to pick and choose a bit to just hit the highlights. But please make time this week to read through the whole thing. It's not that long. It's 10 short chapters. Probably take you maybe 15, maybe 20 minutes to read all the way through. I just want to make sure you don't miss anything, right? Here's a little quick background before we jump into the book. Babylon invaded Judah and took all the people captive and scattered them throughout the empire. Roughly 70 years later, the Medo-Persian Empire took over Babylon, and not long after that, some, but not all, of the Israelites returned to rebuild Judah. But there were several Jewish communities remaining all throughout Persia, and Xerxes became the ruler of Persia after the death of his father, Darius I. All this history is well attested in the Bible and in the modern archaeological record. So we know a lot about this time period. The first chapter of Esther tells about a 6-month-long party that Xerxes threw for himself. And then he added a week more as a party for everyone in town to come and celebrate him too. And we are in Esther chapter 1 at verse 8. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all of his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. Serve each man as much. That doesn't seem like... Well, we'll see here. There are only men in this area. The queen hosted any women at a separate banquet in another part of the palace. Now, what happens when you have hundreds or possibly thousands of men drinking for days on end? Yeah, bad things. Yes. Verses 10 and 11. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Now, these eunuchs, they were the keepers of the king's harem. Some jobs, you get a polo shirt with a logo. Harem keepers had their genitals removed. Yeah, it just goes with the territory. Xerxes sent for his queen. He told the harem keepers to bring her with her crown on her head. Just the crown, if you catch my meaning. Verse 12 says, when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come, and then the king became furious and burned with anger. It seems that Vashti either had some self-respect or she recognized the danger of being a naked woman in the middle of a room full of drunken men, or perhaps both. Now, this embarrassed the most powerful man in the world in a very public way. Vashti's refusal not only made it clear that she wore the pants in this relationship, but also that she would be keeping them on. Thank you very much. Now, the king's lead advisor, this guy named Memucan, said this. This is verse around halfway through 16 through the end of 18. Memucan said, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, this is verse 19, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her a royal position to someone else who is better than she. And then when the king's edict is proclaimed through all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Yeah, I know. Wow, right? But it gets worse. Like verses 21 and 22. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household. And then chapter 2, verse 1 says, Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So essentially, what it's telling us here is Xerxes sobered up. And when he did sober up, he realized he had been an idiot. But he is the ruler of Persia, and any decree that he passes is the law forever and cannot be changed. So, no more women's rights in Persia and no more Queen Vashti for him. Oops. Now, look at verses 2 through 4. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king. Really? This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now, if there's any question, what it means where it says the woman who most pleases the king, it means sexually. This is something that the women will be training for. It's the talent portion of the pageant, as it were. Now, how would someone end up as a contestant here? Agents went looking for attractive girls throughout the kingdom. There was a Jewish man named Mordecai who worked in the king's palace, and we're told in verse 7 of chapter 2 that Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. And this young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So, Esther was attractive, she was near the palace, she got swept up in this search for the new queen. Haggai was responsible for the care and well-being of the king's collection of women. He would have told them what the king expected. He would have told them how to dress, what to eat, how to behave in the king's presence. And he liked Esther. Verse 9, she pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Now, Esther, that was Hadassah's Persian name. It means star, refers to Ishtar, the Persian fertility goddess. The role of a queen was to produce heirs for the king, so this would have been seen as a good omen. Haggai worked to make Esther the very best candidate. He put her on a special diet, he assigned her extra beauty treatments, gave her a squad of handmaidens who would have been responsible for her training. And Mordecai had told her not to say anything about her Jewish heritage or family. I don't know if her background really mattered. The king was more into the test drive than the paperwork, you know? Look at verse 12. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And I can't stress enough the importance of a good moisturizer in a desert environment, nor that of perfume in a world where running water was an uncommon luxury. Verse 13, and this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. There were a lot of applicants. They wanted to be memorable, so they used props. And like the Samson story, the story of Esther is a form of ancient erotic literature. It's very salacious when you read this in Hebrew. The author was intentionally dwelling on the sensual nature of the contest, but the folks who translated this to English, they kind of tried to tone it down because, us Westerners, we don't like to think about that sort of thing. Really, Esther is like a 1960s or 70s sex comedy more than it is like a serious book of the Bible, the way that, we tend to think, oh, it must be all very serious. This is the story that should keep people laughing from pretty much beginning to end, in spite of some of the things that go on. We're still in chapter 2. Look down to verse 14. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem, to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. Now, this is this is any of the women. When they went to the king, they'd go in the evening, and then in the morning they'd come back, but they'd go to a different section of the harem, the one that was the concubine section. Says she would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So the auditions, they lasted from evening through breakfast. Then the women would be reassigned from the harem of virgins to the harem of concubines, and they might spend the rest of their lives there as an abandoned concubine unless they were memorable enough to be called back. Now, Esther, she followed the instructions of her teachers, and everyone really liked her, and then one night, her turn came up. Verse 17 and 18. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his nobles and officials, and he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Ah, what a happy ending! Except this isn't the end. This is the introduction. The story is about to take a strange and violent turn. Mordecai was working the palace gate when he overheard 2 men plotting to assassinate Xerxes, and he told Esther, who told the king. Look down to verse 23. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Impaling. How to do this not too graphically. Impaling was very popular in Persia. The condemned would be hoisted up and then pulled down, and the body was left exposed on that stake as a warning not to do whatever it is that person had done. Yeah. So, there's a lot here, huh? 5 years passed after this. And one man came to dominate among Xerxes' advisors, a man named Haman, and he was put in charge over all of them. Chapter 3, verse 2, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So Haman was treated with respect because the king commanded it. What kind of man needs someone to command that others respect him? Oh, Haman. Yeah. Verses 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And being a good Persian, Haman had his people cast lots to consult the gods about a good day to kill all the Jews, and he came up with March 7th. But it was only April, so he was going to have to wait almost a year before he got to do that. So he went to the king and he said, look, these immigrants, they're ruining our country. They don't look or talk like us. They don't respect our laws, and we need to get rid of them. And then he offered the king 10,000 sacks of silver in exchange for a decree that on March 7th, it would be okay to kill Jews and take their stuff. Welcome to the purge. Yeah. So the decree went out and living in fear began. So for like the next 11 months, these guys are going to be like, my neighbors, my friends, they are going to come over and kill me and take all my stuff. Yeah. Mordecai went to Esther and said, look, go intercede with Xerxes. Don't let this thing happen to our people. And she did that, but she came up with a way to make her request in a little more dramatic way than just showing up and saying, hey, king, please don't. So what she did, she invited the king to come down and have dinner at her palace. And she asked him to bring Haman. Now, Xerxes was not the sharpest knife in the block, but he knew that something was up. So after dinner, he asked her, hey, what's up? But all she said was, and this is, you got to skip down to chapter 5, verse 8. Esther said, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question. Dun, dun, dun! Suspenseful music. Da, 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 da. Yeah. The king agrees to this. They all go home. And on his way out of the palace, Haman sees Mordecai, who, as usual, doesn't bow down or even seems scared of him. And like most bullies, that just ticks him off. So Haman goes home and he tells his wife how things are going great at work. He's the king's favorite. The queen's throwing this special private dinner just for the king and he. But that Jew, Mordecai, is sitting in charge at the gate, and that's all he can think about. Verse 14 in chapter 5 says, his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, we'll have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. Now this suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So what we got here is the wife of Haman saying, you know what you really need? You really need a big stabby pole. And Haman says, yes, what a great idea. And he orders it built so that he can get Mordecai stuck on it. Then we have a scene change as we go to chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. Let me explain real quick. Xerxes had scribes follow him around and write down important events and which leaders did a particularly good job in battle and stuff like that. And then if he had trouble sleeping, he would have the scribes read this stuff to him until he drifted off to sleep. This night, the scribes read about Mordecai warning them about the assassins. Remember, that happened 5 years before. And in the morning, the king was like, hey, did we ever do anything to thank that guy for saving my life? And they kind of realized they hadn't done it. And that is the moment Haman arrives to ask if he can stick Mordecai on a giant spike. But he didn't even get a chance. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And now Haman thought to himself, who is there the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Yes, getting your honor proclaimed throughout the whole city, that would elevate that person to respect almost equal to the king. Yeah. Verse 10, go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Oh, you can just see steam coming out of Haman's ears here, can't you? Haman did what he was ordered to, and he bestowed the highest of honors on his greatest enemy. And then he covered his head, and he did the walk of shame home, getting there just as the king's messengers arrived to bring him to dinner with Esther. In those days, one second. In those days, people ate by lying on these long, low couches that were pulled up towards low tables. The king would have had a central place of honor along with the queen's table on one side and Haman's on the other, and they ate and they drank, and then the king asked Esther to tell him what's up. Yeah, this is the second day we're doing this. What's going on? In chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, we get the answer. Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Now, remember, Xerxes doesn't know Esther's background. So this news kind of comes as a shock to him, and he says, "Oh, who would dare threaten my queen and her people?" Verse 6, Esther says, "Oh, an adversary and an enemy. This vile Haman." Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, you see, more suspense. Yeah, I'll let that go. Now, things click into place for Xerxes here. Haman offered that large payment for the right to kill the Jews. Was his advisor trying to unseat the queen? Was he trying to somehow gain political advantage over the king? Haman said that Jews were unloyal criminals, but hadn't they just spent the day celebrating a Jew for saving the king's life? And it's too much for his brain. In a blind rage, the king just storms out of the room to catch his breath and order his thoughts. Haman at this point realizes the queen is his only hope. He begins to beg her for mercy, for help. He stands up, he rushes over to her side of the table. She's still lying in her seat. He throws himself down on his face beside her. And in verse 8 it says, "Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king exclaimed, 'Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?'" Now, the attendants in the room certainly knew that Haman wasn't really attacking the queen, but remember, Haman was an officious jerk who had to be treated respectfully because the king had commanded it. They were perfectly happy to help the king decide what it is that needed to be done with him. Look at verses 9 and 10. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." And the king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole they had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. In the aftermath, Xerxes gave Esther all of Haman's property and wealth, and she told him how she was related to Mordecai, and the king made him grand vizier in Haman's place. Happy ending? No, sorry. You remember that decree the king made about it being okay to kill Jews on March 7th? Yet decrees from Persian kings can never be revoked. But Esther and Mordecai presented a solution, and Xerxes signed it and sent it out to the world. This is Esther chapter 8, verse 11. The king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. And they had this authority on one day only, March 7th. And the nobles and officers of Persia stood with the Jews because Mordecai was now a powerful man who had the ear of the king. Is it a happy ending now? You know, if Esther was the Disney princess she's made out to be in the children's version of this story, this is where she would make some kind of overture of peace to bring the survivors together to build this new world of racial equality. But she wasn't a Disney princess, and across the empire, the Jewish people hunted down and killed those they believed had wanted to kill them. In fact, more than 500 men, including all 10 of Haman's sons, were killed in the capital city alone. And when Xerxes told Esther what happened, she asked him to impale Haman's sons on spikes and allow the Jewish people in the capital to kill their enemies on March 8th as well. And he granted this request, and that led to another 300 being struck down. And according to Esther 9:16, meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the kingdom's provinces, hang on, let me start that over because I've misread the sentence. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend their lives. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. Yikes. Here's an important question, I think. Where is God in this story? The book of Esther is famously known for the fact that God is never directly mentioned. When we break the story down to its base components, what we have is a nightmare of people being horrible to one another. There's an enslaved population, an orphaned girl seized and forced into sexual service to a rich and powerful man, a society in which the rich can purchase the right to torture, kill, and take whatever they want from an oppressed minority. Scheming villains who want to exact painful deaths on people who don't kowtow to their whims and feed their egos. People who, given the chance to defend themselves, who could have gathered in groups to be safe from attack, decided instead to strike out at those who had struck at them, resulting in the slaughter of tens of thousands. And people who revenged themselves on one evil man by destroying his family line, even to the point of killing all of his children. Where is God in this? We know from Scripture in the Old and New Testaments that none of this is behavior God approves of. So why is this story in his book? Does anything in here reflect the character of God? The same questions come up a lot when we look at the world around us, don't they? Fighting in the Middle East, racial tensions throughout the world, efforts at genocide in many places around the world, non-citizens being held in penal facilities, leaders who are more focused on what they can get by harming those they view as enemies than on helping those they're supposed to be serving. There's not a lot of admirable behavior going on, is there? And when we look around, it can be so easy to focus on the darkness. Death and pain and struggle seem to be our constant companions, so where is God? When we read this story carefully, though, there are flashes of light penetrating the darkness. Esther was degraded, but she rose above her experience without letting anger or bitterness hold her back, and she became beloved by all who knew her. Mordecai was oppressed, but stayed true to the principles of his people where honesty and judgment were concerned. As a result, even under Haman, he is a witness for truth and for what is right, and he rises to a position where he can do great things. He's even willing to save the king who has stolen his treasure, Esther, because it's the right thing to do. Some odd coincidences happen along the way in this story, which might be random chance, or it could be the hand of God directing the world onto his path. The omens and lots putting the decree to destroy the Jews out almost a year ahead of the actual date. The king just happening to remember how much he owes Mordecai the Jew right before Haman comes to ask to kill Mordecai the Jew. Lots of these little things that might be nothing by themselves, but which, when you take them all together, sure seem like some higher power guiding the story towards a better ending. Does that mean God approved of the slaying of those his people thought of as enemies? No, because he made sure when this story was written down, there was evidence of redemption here as well. Before the Jews attacked those they believed would have attacked them, we hear this, Esther chapter 9, verse 2. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them, but no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. Translated literally, it says, no one would stand against them. No one would attack them. God's people were protected. They didn't need to kill anyone. They could have chosen a different path, even though it isn't spoken of as loudly in the text. In many cases, they did. When Mordecai's decree went out before the date set for slaughter, there were these huge celebrations throughout Persia. People recognized the God of the Jews must be very powerful to have arranged to save his people. See, most people in those days thought that, your nation's gods only worked inside your nation's borders. Most thought after this second decree, there would be no bloodshed. The two decrees were going to cancel each other out. Go back another chapter, Esther chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. It says, for the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy. What time are we talking about? We're talking about this 6 months in between the time Mordecai takes over after Haman's been killed and the date of the purge, right? So for the Jews, it was this time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. The fear of the Jews, that's a reference to God. It is one of the names of God that suggests a great respect for his power and sovereignty. Many in Persia became Jews. They converted because they had been overcome by their respect for God. The sages said that many people were circumcised, taking on that symbol of belonging to the family of God of the Hebrews, right? People saw that the Jewish God, even in Persia, was there for his people. The Jews were oppressed, but their God gave them hope. In their pain, God still brought them comfort. In their darkest hour, their God was light, leading them on. And people were like, yes, that is a God I want to be part of the family of, right? That's where we find the Lord in this story. That's where we find the Lord in our stories. Our God is joy coming with the morning light after his dark night of the soul. Our God is the strength sustaining us in darkness and the hope keeping us going where there seems to be no reason for hope. God is the promise of a better tomorrow when today seems lost. Don't lose heart. Don't lose faith. Don't forget the real story of Esther, which is one of God's love for his children and the redemption that is available to all, even those who might at one time or another have seen themselves as his enemies. So seize that truth and let yourself be overcome by the fear of the Jews. Amen. Hey, our time is gone. So whoever you are, wherever you are, grace and peace to you. Remember, you have nothing to fear. Wherever you have found yourself, whatever situation you are in, God is there. Just turn and go with God. Again, grace and peace to each and every one of you, and I will see you next time.